Okay, so today we are very lucky to have the two world-class applied linguists from Georgetown Universities, Professor Heidi Byrnes and Professor Lourdes Ortega in our conversation. And I'm very happy to have them in Hong Kong. So after 1 week, almost 1 week in Hong Kong, so how do you like this trip?
I love it. I had a really good time.
Very, very nice, yes. We've had a very rich program here already, have learned a lot and have enjoyed it. Hospitality has been wonderful, intellectual stimulation has been wonderful, so it's been a very, very nice visit. And thanks to both of you for having been our guides here.
Our pleasure. So we know that you have been really helping us and participant in sharing research sessions and also attending our language and the symposium yesterday. So I was wondering, what do you think about the thing you are mostly excited about in terms of academic atmosphere in our department?
Lourdes, do you want to start? And then I will chime in.
I was very excited to see the atmosphere with the graduate students and the faculty, the degree of communication and collegiality. Everyone is intellectually very engaged, and the research programs that we heard about, they're all connected to the Hong Kong educational landscape. You're doing research at the K through 12 level, you're doing research at the tertiary level, you're examining teachers, textbooks, interaction, language. It's a really rich range of research topics that you're investigating. So I was very impressed by that.
We were talking about it this morning, actually, over breakfast, and about all the things that we have heard and the extent to which your particular geographic location actually translates into a fascinating intellectual location. If we're going to be talking about, as we certainly did in our own presentations, about globalization, well, you're it right here. And very nicely at the intersection of the influence of English as that is shifting in various ways, obviously the influence of Chinese as that is shifting in various ways. You have all multilingualism that one would want. And then actually in line with some of the things that were said yesterday, what struck us also was that you have an opportunity to bridge that infamous gap between the educational, applicable side of the house and the theoretical, and would be able to contribute to the theoretical discussion precisely because of the research opportunities that you have and the level of engagement that people already have in high priority social, societal issues that pertain to language.
Yeah, it's a very exciting combination of local and global issues that you can really offer to the world of applied linguistics, many things in terms of how the local and the global concerns of language and education can be investigated together.
Wow, thanks for a compliment. That's very nice. So I think learn from Heidi's yesterday's talk, I think your curricular thinking is very interesting to us too.
That's true.
Yes. Since your program is very famous and renowned in the North American context now, and it also has exerted tremendous influences to the applied language in different programs in the US. So I'm thinking, how could we translate your kind of curricular thinking into ESL Asian context, especially on secondary education? Because you know, in Hong Kong we have a very complicated situation, as you learned yesterday. But I think, and your recipe is, I mean, the right way we could go out this kind of complexity or this kind of endless discussion on how can we transform or change our language education and language teaching something.
Now there's a big chunk, a big chunk to swallow. I'd be reluctant to, give you recipes here for anything, but I believe that some basic principles could be looked at. It might actually be that the secondary school environment, as you were referring to it, although it may in the end be the most important place where you would want to locate yourself, strategically you might actually start out with some of the rethinking at the college level. And I'm saying that really only for strategic reasons, because substantively I think one should be doing these things at the secondary level, but there you're immediately getting into the huge policy environments and frameworks that already exist for K through 12 education in Hong Kong, and they are likely to be difficult to undo. I know that in your context, higher education also falls under much stronger guidelines than American higher education tends to. But I would think, from what I'm hearing from some of the studies that you're doing, you have somewhat greater freedom there, which was exactly our situation also. Not insignificant reason why we were able to do what we were able to do is that in essence, nobody cared, to put it somewhat flippantly. Or let's put it more positively and say that once we said we would try something like this, nobody interfered. And, educational policy documents are some way of, if not necessarily interfering, at the very least constraining certain things. And you might find that you take what you get, which you would have to do in any case. Whatever comes out of the K through 12 environment, you will have to make the best of it. You ascertain the language abilities that students have. You ascertain what additional abilities need to be developed, and then you yourself make a determination what your particular institutional context might provide to enable learners to do the kinds of things that they desire to do. And then you could yourself start that kind of framing in your context. As has been said many, many times, but deserves reiteration just the same, a curriculum is a local enterprise. It has to fit. So it has to fit the institution, it has to fit the students, it has to fit the institutional niches. You have an institution of higher education, you have certain ambitions around here, you have certain students, you have certain programs around here. You are likely to have certain students with certain interests within the overall student population, and I think the way to start thinking about such matters would be to say, what of these overall guiding principles could we use that would enable us in our context to start rethinking curricular options that we have available to us that would in fact serve our student population. I don't think this is an abstract discussion. It's a very local discussion. And that's actually what makes it interesting.
Oh,
So that would
Field
be...
tenor mode. We can use Michael's register theory to interpret your localized and contextualized curriculum design and application.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Something like that. Yeah.
Very
And then see to it that you inform your major. You must inform your students in any case, and that you gradually, with in the Hong Kong environment, since you do have the advantage of drawing quite heavily on a certain geographically delimited area, though of course it goes beyond it, but you would be able to inform feeder schools, not least because you have these wonderful connections through your educational programs. And this is what we're planning to do for you, and that might actually be an interesting advertising to student populations that are selecting universities. Here's what we're offering for you in light of our interpretation of your needs and your desires and your interests, and we've thought about it, and this is what we've come up with.
Very good.
One thought.
Very powerful solution.
One thought.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and also Professor Lourdes Ortega, you have also talked about in other occasions during this trip in Hong Kong, proposing a bilingual or multilingual term in SLA and also language education. So as Winfred said, with the connection of Hong Kong environment, which we have very typical 3 components in terms of language, which is Mandarin, English, and Cantonese. We call it in Cantonese 三门两语. So how would you think this kind of bilingual or multilingual term instantiates in Hong Kong context, in SLA and language education?
Well, the context is, as you say, already very multilingual. So the turn is a matter of researchers appreciating that multilingualism as the phenomenon that we need to study, and then designing their studies and adapting their research methods to those realities of multilingualism as phenomena worthy of investigation. I've had several conversations with researchers at PolyU, but also at Hong Kong University.
Yes.
Which we visited on Wednesday.
Yes.
At Andy Gao's invitation. And with all the conversations that I've had, something that has come up for those who are interested in doing research in second language acquisition, they were worried about the learners in Hong Kong as participants for their research, their SLA research, and they were telling me, what do we do? How can we study L2 English or L2 Chinese when our pool of participants is so complex in terms of their language learning biographies that it's almost impossible to find a pure L1 English, L2 Chinese, or L1 Chinese, L2 English learner, because they all have these complex multilingual profiles. And so my response to each individual, and very different individuals mentioned that, right? And my response in all the cases was, well, maybe you shouldn't go to mainland China to try to find the pure L1 English, L2 Mandarin,
Yes.
pure participants. Maybe what you need to understand is that this is what we need to investigate as SLA researchers. So the context is rapidly multilingual, and the research needs to actually keep up with that and be sensitive to that, and then we will make our research be very, very exciting and very relevant.
Yeah, very insightful. Yeah.
That's very interesting. So Professor Heidi Byrnes and Professor Lourdes Ortega, since you both are very the top journals in the linguistics editors, so as the from editorial board, so could you provide any suggestions to the Hong Kong young professional in how to target to publish in your journals? Yes, I think this is where also most of the maybe young professional want to know what is happening there and what is the criteria for us to target for the 2 specific journals. Something. Yeah.
I guess the first recommendation I'd make is look at the journals first. What do they publish? It's not the case that things don't change, they do, but one good way to find out whether the kind of research that you're doing would be of interest, so to speak, would fit the profile of the journal, would be to look at, let's say, the last year or 2 at the very least, what kinds of studies were published there. Now, that's not the end of the story, but it would certainly give you a first understanding of the research that seems to be of interest to the journal, how that is then presented, what kinds of emphases are placed within that research, and then related to your own interests. I mean, it's not the case that one needs to absolutely publish in this or that journal. One should really look around and say, where is the best readership also for my kind of research? Because in the end, you want to get an echo for what you're doing, and as we say, join a certain discourse community, where that discourse community, of course, is the readership of the journal. So that would be my first statement. Rather than seeing this as an abstract enterprise, look at journals that in general cover your research area, and then look whether you can find, on the basis of what the journal has done in the last year or so, something that gives you some sort of a sense of, this is more in line with my interests, or this is more in line with my interests. And your interests may actually cover several things. So, but I think giving that some thought is important, because why spend unnecessary time with submitting something to a journal when in the end the editor says you might actually fit better someplace else, which is not a statement of the quality of the article in and of itself. It's just an awareness or a sense on the part of the editor of saying, we would like for you to get the best possible readership, and the best possible readership may not be mine. Maybe somebody else's. So keep that in mind as the first thing. And then, after that kind of an overall statement, and Lourdes can add lots more to that, I would then say, look at some of the editorial statements that have been made, that the journal says, we're interested in X. This is not just abstract talk. This is, in fact, an attempt within the universe of applied linguistics journals to say, we are likely to be more interested in publishing this, and if this is what you do, we are happy to receive your manuscript. For us, for instance, for the MLJ, this is one criterion that is rather difficult to negotiate, quite frankly, is the journal itself calls itself the Modern Language Journal, which in the American context was still very much foreign languages, and increasingly now, because of the proliferation of English, is sort of pitched not ESL, and perhaps not even necessarily EFL, although I'm not sure that's the best way to slice and dice it, but finding a balance between multiple languages and the legitimate environment, of course, of English language teaching. So that's one thing that I watch under the famous category of all things being equal, which they never are. I would privilege a study, if I can say it that way, that would speak to perhaps a language other than English, or English coming out of different multilingual contexts, which is very frequently what it is. So we're studying English in Korea, we're studying English in an Arabic-speaking country, which is a different enterprise than if we're studying it purely in an FL environment in higher education. Maybe we're studying English in primary schools in China, you know, or as your case, we're studying English in middle schools. There's too little of that around. A lot of it is higher education, and so in no time at all, you have a factor in there that would make that kind of a study very appealing, and that would speak immediately to your context, where you have the full spectrum of K through university level engagement with foreign language study, with some very complex and interesting factors entering into it. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, like Heidi says, I think that the first thing in order to be able to publish in a particular journal is to ask yourself, am I already a reader of this journal? And if you're not, but for whatever reason you think that is a journal you want to publish in, you need to become a reader of the journal before you can become an author of the journal. Once you become a reader of the journal, you get familiar with the topics, the framings, the expectations, you get a sense for readership. You become a reader, so you're part of that readership. And so it's more than, I think some authors, novice authors perhaps, they feel it's enough to sort of research the contents of a journal or look at the editorial board and the editors and the statements of the mission of the journal, and after spending a couple of hours doing that, they think they already have a sense for the journal, whether their research fits with it. But I think it's a lot deeper. So you need to become a reader of a journal so that you're part of that readership. So at some point you are also trying to join the authors, and it's the community of authors and readers that make the journal. The other thing is other ways of strategizing in identifying your research communities in terms of publishing is to look at the authors that you continually cite and look them up on the web. Many of them have their CVs. Then you can make yourself a list of the journals where they typically publish their work. And there already you start beginning having a map of what it is in your future, especially a beginning researcher, what kind of a future aspiration for publication venues they can work towards. So I think it's a really contextualized approach to becoming an author. You have to first be a reader, you have to make a map of your own aspirations. You do that by understanding the topics you work in, the people you cite, the work that you read, and the journals that you identify as connected to your own research. So that's one side of things. And the other side is for journals like Language Learning or Modern Language Journal, and most of the so-called international journals, there's a big issue, which is being able to publish highly contextualized research, because nowadays no one wants research that is decontextualized. I think the field of applied linguistics has become knowledgeable enough, mature enough to understand that the best research is always highly contextualized, stemming out of a particular context for language learning, for language education. But at the same time, if you're going to be publishing in a journal like Language Learning or Modern Language Journal, you need to be making a contribution to theory, a contribution that is viewed as valuable and original by all the other readers who are researchers. So the readers of our journals, they themselves are active researchers. It's not the kind of readership of general educators or teachers or a mixed readership of both researchers and teachers. These journals, at least the two journals that we represent, they really are read mostly by researchers. So a lot of what we put into our studies needs to appeal to other fellow researchers. And for that, it's not enough to do a really good study, very, very well written up, with the best theoretical framework inspiring the research, but in the end the research needs to come back to the theories and contribute, add, transform, question, in some way go back and make a contribution to the theory building itself. And that, I think, is the most difficult step, especially for novice researchers.
Yes, I would echo that completely. And for the MLJ, which has as part of its self-created mandate, the linkage to teaching and learning in a very strong fashion, that becomes, as Lourdes was saying, very often a hurdle. And I find myself then saying, this is a wonderful study, but it isn't sufficient to just tack onto it in the discussion section something or other that potentially, might generalize this for the larger readership. That has to be framed in a more sophisticated way. And it's a complex enterprise, because particularly at the beginning, you're being so immersed in your study, and its particularities sometimes makes it difficult to take a few steps back and say, what are some of the other issues that are out there in the field that would actually enable me, as I am discussing what I'm doing here, to make linkages that the larger readership of the journal, which is quite diverse, sees as, oh, never thought of it that way. And yet it is something that I, who is actually doing something potentially quite different, would nevertheless see as a link that would then fulfill the larger requirement that the journals do have, and the ambitions that they have of saying, we are contributing to knowledge in the field. And knowledge in the field is not just a little local area, but knowledge in the field is for this quite diverse readership who do quite different things. So that's an intellectual step. That's a matter of how to write it up, become more expansive with it, being able to step back. And for studies that are heavily located in particular educational contexts, that is sometimes a very difficult hurdle to cross, because teaching, learning, educational issues are highly localized in and of themselves. And then to say, what is the larger contribution of what you're doing is a challenging undertaking. But when it succeeds, it's wonderful.
And I would add, there are many very, very good journals with a narrow focus, narrow in a positive sense, just like a very well-defined focus for the research. So some journals devoted to writing or technology or teaching specifically. And so language learning in particular is very, very broad in the large range of topics that we want to publish, and the very varied ways of doing research that we want to attract. So we publish experimental quantitative studies, we publish qualitative anthropological studies, ethnographic studies. We even publish first language acquisition studies. So the range of topics is daunting. And for new authors trying to publish in language learning, once again, if they don't know the journal well, and if they don't have become readers yet of the journal, it's very difficult to get a sense for whether their topic matches the journal and how to frame their topic so that this theoretical contribution to the research community becomes clear in their manuscript. So I think the wider the topical and methodological and epistemological scope of a journal, the more difficult even it is to understand how you can become an author for that journal.
I'd want to add something else to it, which I think is a very complex matter, and it's hard to know how to address it. We are keenly aware in the highly refereed journals, international journals, of the enormous pressure that young researchers, particularly in the Asian context, are under. And sometimes that has very negative consequences actually, or the potential for negative consequences. Let me put it like this. We are aware, for instance, that Korean universities now have requirements that say before we are willing to grant a PhD degree, we would like evidence from you that you have published in an internationally refereed journal. Those are demands and strictures that are purely administrative on some level. Obviously, they have a reason for why they were included, but they may actually be negative in many ways. And for young researchers to move against them is likely to be very difficult. Well, you won't be able to if that's what comes down from on high. That's what it is. But it undermines the real needs that the country has for the very reasons that we have just mentioned. If these are studies that are intricately and intimately related to teaching and learning of languages in this particular country's context, then the kinds of things that we have just mentioned that an international journal wants to see and must see, because it can only select so many studies, may lead to a rejection, not because the study isn't good, but because it is still quite contextualized, and it would be a study that would be superb in a journal in that particular country. So the stipulation from universities that you must publish in an internationally refereed and highlighted journal, to some extent can actually undermine the publication presence of this kind of research in the country itself. And that's very problematic because your educators in your country may not necessarily be reading the international journals. They would get much more out of a highly refereed, high quality journal that deals with the concerns in the country. And it's very difficult for international journals to negotiate that. The ambitions that young researchers that have then in publishing in the international journal on one level are completely understandable because pressures are being exerted on you. At the same time, we sort of look at it, and we've had this discussion in the journal editors, so I'm purposely using we. It's just not me. In our meetings, we've said this is a real problem and we don't know how to address it, other than saying to the country organizations, please see to it that you yourself in your country context create publication opportunities that are highly refereed, meet all the quality standards that an international journal otherwise upholds, and yet deal with the specific concerns that you have, which deserve to be addressed in a highly refereed journal, and an international journal may not necessarily be the best place to go. Now, how do you convince university administrators of that? That's a hard act to decide, but I think it has to be part of the larger professional discussion that should go on, because it's actually countervening dynamics that are going on that are not very healthy deep down.
Very insightful.
Yeah.
Very insightful.
I think our audience will find really interesting and useful.
I'm sure they can identify with some of it because we certainly see it. Yeah.
Yes, I want to ask another question for Professor Lourdes Ortega, because I attended your synthesis classes in Georgetown last semester, and I have learned a lot from this course. And after one semester now, and I found that what do you think of research synthesis in applied linguistics? Do you think it's just a field which is parallel like SLA, or is kind of just a methodology within SLA this field? What is your perception of research synthesis?
Research synthesis is a methodology.
Yeah.
It's a set of methodologies and approaches to make sense of published research and to do literature reviews in a way that is more systematic, more replicable, more accountable than the traditional narrative review. So it's an added option to making sense of accumulated research. I don't see it as a part of SLA, I see it as a new set of methods and approaches that can be used for any topic in applied linguistics. Not just second language acquisition is just one part of applied linguistics. But you can synthesize a very large number of topics in any area of applied linguistics. We have seen a huge increase in the amount of meta-analysis in our field, and that's a very nice development, I believe. At the same time, I see that there is much less interest in other forms of synthesis that are not meta-analysis. And there is even less interest in tackling the issue of synthesizing qualitative research, qualitative primary research instead of quantitative research. Meta-analysis can only synthesize quantitative primary research. Other forms of synthesis can be applied to any kind of topic, and when the primary research studies are qualitative, then we need even more specific ways of synthesizing that are epistemologically congruent with qualitative interpretive research. So I think that those are the challenges for the future of research synthesis in applied linguistics, to actually understand the value of synthesis that is not meta-analysis, because meta-analysis can only be applied to quantitative primary research that has accumulated greatly, because if accumulation hasn't been sufficient, we shouldn't meta-analyze a topic. And so a synthesis approach instead of a meta-analysis approach has much more potential for the field. And then also the question, if the field is moving so much into very, very diverse ways of doing qualitative interpretive research, and there are many different approaches right now that are qualitative in the field of applied linguistics, then isn't it worthwhile to make sense of the accumulated research in those paradigms, those qualitative paradigms as well? I think it is very important to do that, but for that we need to develop approaches that are qualitative synthesis approaches. They exist out there in other fields, so it would be just a very exciting project for researchers who work within qualitative paradigms to look out in education, in health sciences, to see how the methodologies they have developed for qualitatively synthesizing qualitative primary studies can be also introduced and applied to our own qualitative topics.
Because I also learned that from your course that there's somebody who has finished their PhD on synthesis, right? So that's why I'm thinking whether synthesis could be a kind of a field in SLA, because people are doing the PhD topic is synthesis. Some researchers did their dissertation, their doctoral dissertation. Yes.
Study as a synthesis or a meta-analysis study, but that's just like saying people have done an experimental, quasi-experimental study on X topic, right? So we always have a methodology on an X topic.
Okay. I get what you mean.
Yeah, and don't forget, I mean, I do not, there is a balance to strike. You cannot be a professional meta-analyzer or professional synthesizer, learn very well those methodologies, but then not have any substantive area of research that you can synthesize. You cannot do that, right?
Yeah.
Because a synthesis cannot do anything on a topic that they don't know well.
Wow.
So one possibility is to create teams of researchers within applied linguistics, some of whom are very well trained in this methodologies of meta-analysis and synthesis, and other people in the team would be very knowledgeable about content areas, and then team up that way. but generally speaking, you just cannot be a professional meta-analyzer or synthesizer and not have substantive areas in applied linguistics
Absolutely.
that you're an expert in. Yeah.
Can't agree more.
Yes.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And Professor Lourdes Ortega has given a very inspiring talk on research synthesis on Tuesday of our poly seminar talks. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and also the talk on the same day, Professor Heidi Byrnes has been given the talk on moving from communicative competence to self-motivated system and willing to communicate by themselves. So with connection of Hong Kong context, and you have been attending the symposium yesterday, maybe have some insights of Hong Kong context, saying that we know that in some contexts and also in some contexts in mainland China, that most of the secondary schools are like based on exam driven. Yeah, but the government has done a really supportive and also spent a lot of money on how to enhance communication with the students, and also how to train the teachers to enhance their communication skills. But still, they have balance between the communication and the exam. So how would you think about this kind of situation and this kind of balance?
It's another tricky question.
You're getting all the tricky questions.
Well, education contexts do create the tricky questions. I mean, in line with what was said yesterday, the comment from one of the audience members, of course, about, okay, this is all fine and dandy. How about the parents moving into all of this? Yes, and everybody was nodding and said yes,
Terrible.
yes, all right. Well, as that comment was being batted around in the audience, so to speak, I was thinking, and then, just as you were saying, Nancy, the really big elephant in the room is assessment. The parents are a medium-sized elephant.
Yes.
The big elephant in the room is assessment. How do you deal with that? Okay, so where does one start, so to speak? I suppose, coming back to your Hong Kong context, maybe the way to do it is to, for these various universities or those that are beginning to work with each other, and Polly, you would be in a good position to take on a certain leadership role here and say, we can't do everything. It's out of the question. So what kinds of things would be really, really important to research here that would take our context seriously with regard to the fact that we do wish to enhance communicative abilities, let's call it that, but we don't necessarily need to feel like replicating everything that was said in a non-multilingual environment, or in an environment that was heavily English dominant out of the late 70s and early 80s in the British context. We know much more about these matters in the meantime. And your textbook studies, I think, to some extent, would actually be an interesting starting point, where you would then look at, okay, the textbooks are the textbooks. We all know that textbooks drive the affair. That's just the nature of the game. As I said yesterday in my curriculum talk, if we don't have a curriculum, the textbook is the curriculum anyway. So, and then the textbook becomes the pedagogy, and in no time at all, where's the teacher? You have to ask yourself that question, and where's the learning? So you're doing your textbook studies, and then, for instance, one way to look at this is, so what actually happens with the textbooks? You have the evidence from what the textbooks seem to be foregrounding as activities, but the textbooks are only part of the show. And I mentioned that there is a study that will be coming out in the fall issue where, of the MLJ, where they use the theoretical construct of the ecology of the language classroom, where language policy, language education policy, and you have a very defined one around here, so you have an advantage. The textbook, the teacher form an ecology of the classroom, and in the end, it's what the teacher does with that material. In a particular classroom context that is of interest. You know very well that we had very negative treatments for a while of the initiation, response, and evaluation routine, so to speak, of quote-unquote communicative language teaching. And it got bashed big time. Like, this is a real no-no. You shouldn't be doing this pedagogically. Well, until we started looking at it a little bit more carefully, and lo and behold, and we found some of that stuff is actually quite good in the sense of that it brings out certain communicative behaviors on the part of the teacher. So just because it's IRE doesn't all mean it's to be banned from the classroom. And you may find the same thing, and if you then did such studies, you could in fact use them for teacher development. See, they may be doing some very interesting things with textbook material that otherwise might raise some eyebrows, and say, well, what is this? But if the teachers themselves have resources and ways of using that material that enhances classroom interaction with the students, then that's about as good as it's going to get, because the textbook industry is a textbook industry. We're not going to undo that very quickly. So perhaps the better place to move into the entire enterprise is to say, here are the textbooks, we've analyzed them. Maybe we can influence the textbook industry somewhere, but deep down, your better leverage may actually be in terms of teacher development, teacher education and teacher development. And then look at what kind of changes you might be able to bring about in your own teacher education programs, if you have them, and in your teacher development activities, if you have them, and then enable the teachers themselves to come up with assessments in their classrooms that would be in line with those kinds of pedagogies. My probably too idealized notion, but I'll put it on the table just the same, is still this. If these approaches that we're advocating have any merit at all, they should actually be able to withstand even the narrow assessment routines. I'm saying that because the same thing happened when we shifted to communicative language teaching or proficiency-oriented language teaching in the US. And there was a big hue and cry about, are we disadvantaging our students because the assessment routines are still very heavily grammar driven? And they are. Same dichotomy, same tension. And I found myself saying in the end, gulp, gulp. If this is supposed to really be as good as I would like for it to be, I actually would want to see both happening simultaneously. I would like to see that they're able to use the language communicatively and at the same time are able to get the grammar. Otherwise, we've got a problem anyway. And so applying that kind of thing to your situation, if these kinds of pedagogies with textbooks as they are are successful and are useful, then it should be possible to make sure that the kinds of questions that are on the assessment instruments can also be handled competently by the learners. That doesn't mean just teaching to the test. Now that's kind of a tall order, but I think deep down that's actually the claim we're making, because if we are ourselves dichotomizing, over here is more communicative language teaching and over here is the more form-oriented abilities that need to be developed, call it grammar, call it lexicon, call it whatever you want to call it, then there's something wrong with the argument. The argument has to be that we are attending to both, because both are necessary for the long-term development. So I think one has to kind of take a step back and say, what are we claiming anyway? And I think we ought to be claiming that those two things, language development in the comprehensive way that we're after, should enable to address both issues. Now, it's going to be unfortunate if the test only addresses one thing, but in the end, the classroom instruction and the language development ought to be able to address both.
Yeah, it's really good.
Yes.
I really love it. Yeah.
So, I mean, since you both are very competent writers, especially L2 writers from my perspective, right? And I'm thinking with the development of the new technology like YouTube and different pictures, Instagram, something, this kind of software explosion. So how do you perceive L2 writing along this kind of development of internet? So I'm thinking now whether like monolingual just languages will disappear, or will the role of the language will play less important than before. So what do you perceive this problem?
Are you talking about languages disappearing? Is that what you're saying?
L2 writing, the role.
L2 writing disappearing?
Yeah.
Or because of other forms of
Yeah, meaning making.
more multimodal text?
Oh, you mean instruction?
Multi.
You actually meant writing in it. I'll leave that one to you.
Yes.
Well, I don't think that writing will disappear, but it may be transformed in what we mean by writing. I mean, we still use the word writing when we talk about the field of second language writing, but we also use the word literacy and multi-literacies and critical literacies. And we do say literacy in singular, but more often even in plural, right? So I think that the concepts may be developing, and they are reflecting developments in how we communicate through images and text and links and hypertexts, right? So yes, we are evolving a lot, but I think in the end, we do have the spoken communication that we all do, which we can now do also remotely, so synchronously and yet geographically displaced with Skype and other forms of computer-assisted, computer-mediated communication, mobile communication.
Yeah.
And so we are moving also in our literacies into new forms of creating meaning that is not through the spoken language or through the sign language. Let's not forget sign languages, which are also immediate communication. Right? So all these new developments, I think we will continue just using language for communication purposes, for relational purposes, for knowledge creation purposes. And we researchers in applied linguistics will be moving ahead with the developments and studying and understanding those developments at the same time. So I'm not afraid of technology. I'm not a huge technological person, but I'm not afraid of technology. I think like with language use and with communication, with thinking, with knowledge creation, all human phenomena are always evolving and changing and metamorphosing, and we just do it, and then we continue doing our research to try to make sense of the human the human worlds we create. So we may change a lot in the field of L2 writing, but I think we will still have a lot of interesting things to study.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So one last question from me. Should we just write down your next schedule of visiting? It's really, really productive and inspiring 1 week. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah,
Thank you. It's been such
very
a
much
pleasure.
enjoyed it. Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. It's been
Lots of learning on our part, and
We learned
to
a lot,
the
yeah.
extent that we have contributed something on your end, we're all the more pleased.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
That's very lovely.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah, thank
you.
you.
Thank you. Yeah.